はい、ではただいまから安全保障国際シンポジウムの第2セッションを開始いたしたいと思います。第2セッションのテーマは安全保障目的の宇宙利用に関する主要国の政策であります。午前中と同じようにですね、このセッションも日英の両言語で配信しております。画面下部の通訳ボタン、これによってこれを切り替えてですね、ご視聴いただければ幸いです。第2セッションでは、まず4名の研究者から20分ずつご発表をいただきます。その後、討論者からのコメントと質問に対しまして、各発表者にお答えいただく形で進めていきたいと思います。この後に続きます第3セッションの統合葬儀において、時間が許せばですね、聴講者の皆様からのご質問にお答えしたいと考えております。ご質問はですね、Zoom の Q&A 機能、これを通じて随時受け付けております。ご質問については、質問の相手先を明記していただいた上で、質問を送信していただければ幸いです。それではまず最初の発表者でございますけれども、英国ダラム大学准教授のブレディン・ボーエン先生にお願いしております。ボーエン先生はアメリカジョージ・ワシントン大学宇宙政策研究所訪問研究員、キングスカレッジロンドン講師、レスター大学准教授を経て、今年の9月からですね、現職に就かれております。ご発表のタイトルは、グローバルな宇宙時代における英国であります。では、ボーエン先生、お願いいたします。
Okay. Right, arigato gozaimasu. Thank you so much. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be back in Japan. And I have about 20 minutes to speak. And I'm presenting to you today on the UK in the global space age, hopefully to give you an idea on the past and present of Britain in space. And the bottom line up front, or the main takeaway of this presentation that I want to give to you really is that the UK finds itself caught in something of a binary system. It is caught between two very large blocks, one the United States and two Europe, or the European Union on the other side. And Britain has always had to navigate these two large blocks in space in the entirety of the space age, and that has not changed in recent years and will continue to define British space policy. So Brexit did not cause any particular new problems with regard to managing the British space sector, but it has caused some intensification of some issues and points of frictions that Britain has had in space over many years. So this is particularly challenging, of course, with political volatility in the United States and across Europe. The US-UK special relationship may be strained in the years to come, and the Starmer government, the Labour Party, and also the British people are far from natural allies with the current personalities incoming in with the Donald Trump administration. Of course, with political turmoil in Europe, the ability to switch between relying on one side of the equation or the other is not an easy or a smooth choice to make. So, two of the biggest challenges facing the UK in space security are how to make its relatively meagre resources matter, and more importantly, in which direction, where to commit those resources. And as a good academic, I am better at identifying problems than solutions. So I do not have good, clear answers to those questions, but hopefully this presentation will help you understand the challenges and the trade-offs that Britain is facing as a modest space power. Let's see if these works. There we go. Okay, so The British dependence on the United States in space was not some inevitable fact that was predestined to happen. The UK chose to become dependent on the United States. And this was not that obvious in the early years of the space age. So Britain today has no sovereign launch capability in space, and it has very few sovereign assets in orbit. But it remains one of the most modernized military powers on Earth, and it can draw on cutting-edge support and intelligence capabilities from space through its alliance with the United States and NATO more broadly. So this is in a very large contrast to France, which sustains a significant missile and space launch vehicle industry and remains the fulcrum of the European launcher system. So Britain is far less of a sovereign space power. So how did Britain enter this position? The United States really is the main answer to that, and that special relationship which developed by the 1950s. But in the 1940s and the early 1950s, the relationship between Britain and the United States was not what we would call special. Even after the cooperation over the Manhattan Project in World War II, the McMahon Act of 1946 froze out the British from what was then a joint British and American nuclear weapons program. And this was a real shock to the British. And Ernest Bevin, the UK Foreign Secretary in the Attlee government, had a very terse conversation with the US Secretary of State at the time. He said, "We've got to have this, the atomic bomb. I don't mind for myself, but I don't want any other UK Foreign Secretary to be talked at or to by the Secretary of State in the United States as I just have with Mr. Burns. We've got to have the nuclear fission bomb over here, whatever it costs. We've got to have the bloody Union Jack on top of it." And this was a mentality that shaped the early British rocket program. And the medium-range ballistic missile developed by the British in the 1950s was Blue Streak. So that MRBM, which is on display in the National Space Centre in Leicester, was also the first stage of the Europa launcher, the ill-fated Europa launcher. And once this system was built, however, the British cancelled it. So we built a working missile and then decided we'd had enough. Because by the 1960s, the British had repaired the relationship with the Americans, and we decided to use American delivery systems such as Skybolt and later Polaris. So we kept on making our own nuclear bombs, but then we'd rely on the Americans for the missiles that would actually deliver them. Because without a delivery system, all you have is a nuclear mine. So with that taken out of the picture, Britain really didn't see any future in having its own launch capability. But also, in contrast to Western Europe in the early Cold War, Britain importantly had access to American space launch vehicles to launch British satellites for military and industrial purposes. Western European countries did not have that kind of access. And this helped develop the Western European integrated launch effort. But in Britain, of course, it was easier to make sure our interests were accounted for in American calculations rather than duplicating the American rocket effort. So this special relationship really was special between Britain and the United States. In space, nuclear, missile, and intelligence circles, Britain has had privileged access that no other state has. Even within the Five Eyes network, Britain retains a privileged position in there. So, like many of the major space powers today, Britain's history in space can't be divorced from the nuclear and militarized dimensions of it. The original sin of space technology, its origins as a military necessity, is also true for Britain, where there was no necessity in the minds of the British government to have a fully independent nuclear deterrent, and therefore also no fully independent access to space. And what's also important to remember is that in the 1950s, Britain was very much on track to being the third space power, third only to the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is commensurate in the global infrastructures that were being used for these as well, including imperial territories, most notably for the British and the European launcher effort in Woomera in Australia. And also today we see the imperial legacies of the space age continuing with the use of French Guiana, but also the use of Baikonur in Kazakhstan, Xinjiang in China as well. So these impacted a lot of people around the world and not always for the better. But it shows a part of British history that is often neglected today and is not part of how people view Britain in space today. There was a very, very large launcher and missile development program that was ultimately cancelled by Britain. So a cautionary tale there for smaller or middle space powers is that just because you've built working rockets doesn't mean you will keep them. Decisions can always be made to get rid of them. So enough of the history lesson. On to modern considerations. So, in recent years, there's been a sea change in the British state and government with regard to space policy. The last major document was the 2021 National Space Strategy, and that set out a plan for £10 billion worth of spending over 10 years. Which I know by American standards doesn't sound like much, but for the British, that is quite a lot of money for explicit space spending. And the vast majority of this, around £5 billion, is being spent on Skynet 6, the secure military and government satellite communications program, a series of geostationary SATCOM satellites. So the vast majority is on modernising existing assets, and about £1.4 billion has been allocated to other Ministry of Defence space projects, in particular the I-STAR-I programme, a intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance satellite research programme. Also, there was the 2022 Defence Space Strategy, and this was the first of its kind in the UK, which emphasised the own access and collaborate framework, recognising that Britain's role in space is as a partner with others, not so much as a sovereign space power in its own right. So it recognises the limited unilateral capabilities that Britain has. So there's no scope here to go into detail on each of these documents, but it hopefully illustrates the institutionalisation of space policy in the UK. Prior to 2014 or 2015, there was hardly any central space policy documentation from the UK government. So now we've had a string of documents for the last 10, 15 years, including the foundation of the UK Space Agency in 2010. So now space policy is a recognised subject and policy area in its own right in Westminster, and people like me no longer get funny looks when I talk about space policy in Britain. They know what it is now. So a more recent document and a supplement to the 2021 National Space Strategy was the 2023 National Space Strategy in Action. And again, this is not to go into too much detail, but to give you a flavour of how at least the previous Conservative government saw its priorities in space across the security and economic and scientific sectors. Ambitious plans over launch, capturing the European market for small satellite launches, though there is intense competition across Europe for that, which I'm sure Dr. Pascoe will go into as well. But climate change and environmental sustainability, of course, are very important, and also using space as an engine for economic growth and also foreign direct investment are very, very crucial. Now, there have been many significant decisions made in recent years under the successive Conservative Party governments. And the UK government calls its priority defence and security capabilities defence highly assured capability areas. And I've tried to summarise them as clearly as possible into one slide. The documentation is not always the clearest on these. But SATCOMs remains the most important. It's where the UK breaks its own rules, is exceptional in having a space-based system at all. So the Skynet system remains the central focus for the British MOD in space. So there are currently 2 4th-generation Skynet satellites that are being decommissioned. There are, I think, around 5 5th-generation Skynet satellites, and there will be, I believe, at least 3 6th-generation Skynets to be deployed over the next few years, all in geostationary orbit. So this provides backbone secure communications capability for the Ministry of Defence, but also for the UK intelligence community as well, in particular government communications headquarters, in particular with its liaisons with the US National Security Agency. So a real critical capability for the UK and a large part of the UK's space industrial strategy as well. Telecommunications remains a particular strength of UK space industry, and Airbus is the main contractor for Skynet. In 2020, the Boris Johnson government bailed out the OneWeb mega constellation company to the tune of around $500 million, alongside the Indian company Bharti Telecom. And this 600 satellite constellation now is registered in the UK, but of course the factory is still in Florida. And since the UK acquired it, shares were sold to Eutelsat, which was then acquired by Airbus. I will leave it to legal philosophers to determine whether it's really British or not. But the UK government retains a particular share in it, so there's still some UK government influence in the governance of the OneWeb system. So it's unknown what role OneWeb can play specifically in any future UK SATCOMs plans, whether civil or military at this stage. We'll wait and see if the Starmer government will make announcements on that. Space domain awareness is another really important area for the UK, and where the UK does have capability. So through the phased array radar at RAF Fylingdales in the North Yorkshire Moors, Britain provides a very important early warning missile tracking and detection capability for the US and NATO. This feeds data to the United States, which then is transported back to the UK alongside the larger US missile tracking and early warning system, as well as space domain awareness data as well, which is then handled by UK Space Command at RAF High Wycombe in southern England. So this has been a long-established radar site. RAF Fylingdales was constructed very early in the Cold War. And interestingly, the UK government has announced that it wants to build a new Deep Space Advanced Radar Capability, or DARC, in the UK as part of the AUKUS agreement. And this will be alongside a new geostationary tracking radar system built in the United States and Australia as well. And the site for this is in Cawdor Barracks in Pembrokeshire in southwest Wales, pending local approvals. This would be a major new capability on site in the UK. The hardware, I believe, is being built in the United States by Lockheed Martin, if I'm not mistaken. And this would be the first dedicated space tracking radar on UK soil. The Fylingdale site in northern England is first and foremost a missile warning and tracking system. Its space tracking duties are secondary. So this DARC radar, which you can see an artist's impression of that would be dedicated for tracking objects in the geostationary belt, for first and foremost for the military. Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance is a new area of interest for the UK in terms of satellite deployments. We have long been users of US overhead imagery and support systems. Now the Ministry of Defence is developing its own research and development systems here as well. So the I-STAR-I system is a series of 5 or 6 different satellites, each one doing something different. So there's an experimental communication satellite, synthetic aperture radar, electro-optical imagery. And they are testing out new techniques, and which technologies may be part of a larger constellation in future remains to be seen, but that project should be complete by 2030. But it's not an operational constellation, it's very much a research and development constellation. And I believe there are 2 of those satellites now in orbit. So the RAF is developing more satellite operational capabilities now by flying those satellites. But it remains to be seen whether, with these new hardware capabilities, whether the analytical and operational capacity of staff in the MOD will be able to keep up. So there are real pressures on recruitment and skills and retention of skilled personnel as well within the Ministry of Defence. Space control is an area that the Defence Space Strategy and Space Doctrine talks about. And at the moment, the UK MOD only speaks in terms of defensive space control, not offensive. So hardening satellites, more resiliency measures, more passive approaches to making satellites more secure. And this would correspond to defensive space control in American space doctrine language as well. So the UK Space Power Doctrine document, JDP 0-40, that explains that quite clearly as well, again, following the lead of the Americans there. The UK has also signed up to the ban on direct ascent kinetic kill weapons testing, so there's no scope for any kind of counter-space capability for kinetic weapons from the UK. The UK has not explicitly talked about non-kinetic anti-satellite weapons either, unlike France, for example. So the UK is not talking about offensive space activities in any way yet. On a final note on these assured capability areas on position, navigation and timing, what's interesting is that PNT systems are not included in the defence highly assured capability areas, but they do feature prominently in the 2024 Space Industrial Strategy. So there is industrial and commercial interest in the UK in some kind of PNT investments or capabilities, but the UK Ministry of Defence is not pursuing PNT as something specific just yet. Now, PNT can refer to a wide range of technologies, so that could mean anything that has any kind of PNT service, so not just GNSS or augmenter systems, but even an augmenter such as EGNOS or QZSS would be extremely difficult for the UK to do anytime soon. So the UK was part of the Galileo project, of course, but only built the navigation payloads, not the rest of the system. So it would be a real challenge for the UK to develop even a modest navigation system in space. So I believe my time is fast running out. So the global space age is sort of a larger concept I'm working with in my own research now, but it's to put what different countries are doing in space into hopefully a useful wider context. And you can see these numbers, of course, are from 2023, so the numbers are a bit bigger on all fronts now, but just to give you the same idea of scale and proportions here. And within Europe, of course, the UK does look big with the OneWeb satellites registered to it, but if you take those out, Britain looks very modest compared to many other countries. Now, these numbers only tell you so much. They don't tell you anything about the quality of satellites or whether they meet all needs equally, but it's to show that Britain is a very modest space power in terms of direct assets in space. However, it is a very important part in the larger European space industry system, and also as a partner to the United States in providing a lot of various niche capabilities as well. So you'll be glad to hear I'm coming to the end. So Britain remains caught really in a binary system, and you could characterize Britain's military and security relationship with the United States in space as one of dependency. It's no point being in denial about that. We are reliant almost totally on the US for our critical space capabilities. However, with Europe, it is very much a story of integration. Britain, in terms of industry and the commercial and scientific aspects of space, has been a major part of the wider European system, both in the European Space Agency and, of course, until recently, the European Union as well, and their respective space activities. So Britain has outsized influence relative to its direct holdings through its alliances and partnerships and integrations in the transatlantic arena. In the European Space Agency now, the UK is the 5th biggest contributor, or the 4th biggest state contributor. The European Union, Germany, France, and Italy pay more into the European Space Agency budget than the UK. You can see the percentages on the screen there. The Russia and Ukrainian war, of course, is showing the importance of space systems yet again, and the MOD in the UK is again talking about needing more assured access and new capabilities in space, but the same was being said after the 1991 Gulf War and the various interventions of the 90s, and in particular the Kosovo War as well. So I'm getting a lot of deja vu in the commentary on the importance of space following the Russia-Ukraine war, as I saw in the literature from the 1990s and the 2000s. In terms of extra transatlantic opportunities, of course, the Global Air Combat Programme with the UK, Italy, and Japan. So there's ongoing advanced technical cooperation now, which could easily lend itself to wider space dimensions. The UK and Japan have signed a terms of reference agreement, and of course, South Korea as well is an opportunity for middle powers to cooperate, although South Korea has its own launch capabilities, which is more than we can say for the British. In terms of things to watch out for on the British context, the Starmer government is still working on a strategic defence review and a spending review. And these two reviews will determine a lot of decisions going forward. And I think we can see a lot of continuity in space from the last 14 years of Conservative government. So I don't think the Labour government will change a lot in the years to come, but the financial situation is pretty difficult. So I imagine there will be some cuts, but no large change in direction. So I will stop there. Arigato gozaimasu for listening.
ボウエン先生、ありがとうございました。先生からはイギリスの宇宙利用におけるアメリカとの特別な関係、言い換えれば依存ということかもしれませんけれども、それを歴史も追いながらですね、ご説明いただいた上で、最近そのイギリス政府が宇宙政策についてその組織化というかですね、それを明確にするようないくつかの文書を発表してきたということと、今後の問題としてはやはりそのリソースのその制限というものが大きな課題になるだろうというお話をいただいたかと思います。それでは続きまして、防衛研究所政策研究部グローバル安全保障研究室の福島康仁主任研究官が発表を行います。福島主任研究官は宇宙政策、宇宙安全保障を専門にしております。 発表のタイトルは、日本の防衛宇宙政策、これまでと次の10年であります。では、福島主研よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、防衛研究所主任研究官の福島です。私の方から今ご紹介いただきました通り、日本の防衛宇宙政策のこれまでと今後約10年につきましてお話をですね、させていただければと思います。あらかじめお伝えしておきますと、私の発表というのはあくまで個人的な見解に基づいて行うというもので、所属しております組織を代表するものではないということをご理解いただければと思います。でまずですね、私の方からお話をしたいのは、この日本の防衛宇宙利用の歴史であります。すいません、少々お待ちください。はい、すいません、お待たせいたしました。はい、で私の方からはですね、まず日本の防衛宇宙利用の歴史についてお話をしたいと思うんですけれども、と言いますのは、日本国内あるいは海外においてもいまだにですね、日本の防衛宇宙利用というものは2008年に成立した宇宙基本法ができて初めて始まったというですね、誤解が広く見られるわけです。他方でここにスライドの方にも書きました通り、自衛隊が宇宙を使ってきた、宇宙のサービスを使ってきた歴史ということを振り返ってみると、それはですね、半世紀以上にわたる歴史というものがあるわけです。でこれはですね、公開情報に基づいて分かるところをですね、まとめてみた図になるわけですけれど、表になるわけですけれども、2008年に宇宙基本法ができる前にどういった用途にですね、どういった衛星を自衛隊が使っていたのかということをまとめてみますと、一般的なこのイメージとしては非常に2008年より前というのは限られた用途に一部限定的に衛星をですね、自衛隊の運用に使っていたというイメージを持たれる方が多いわけですけれども、実際のところはですね、気象観測といった環境モニタリング、衛星通信、情報監視偵察、即位後方時刻参照、そして弾道ミサイルの探知といった早期警戒に至るまでですね、ほぼこの宇宙が提供してくれる機能についてはほぼ全ての分野について宇宙基本法ができる前から使っていたという歴史があるわけです。かつ使っていた衛星というのはもちろん宇宙基本法ができる前なので、自衛隊あるいは昔で言えば防衛庁、その後は防衛省が衛星を持つということはなかったわけですけれども、他方で外国政府が持っている非軍事衛星であるとか、日本国内の非防衛目的の衛星、さらには商業衛星であったり、外国の軍事衛星、それから日本国内のですね、多目的衛星といったものを使うことによって、こうした幅広い宇宙関連の能力というものを使ってきていたわけです。それもですね、補助的な役割で使っていたわけではなくて、例えば衛星通信ということを考えてみますと、このスーパーバードというですね、日本の商業通信衛星について言えば、そこに載せていた専用の通信中継機を使って、それがですね、やはり特に海上自衛隊を中心とした自衛隊の運用においては基幹通信として位置づけられていたわけですし、またこの弾道ミサイル防衛ということを考えてみましても、1990年代の半ばからですね、米国の方から早期警戒情報 SEW というものをですね、受信しながら使ってきたという歴史があるわけです。そうした意味では基本的に自衛隊というものが宇宙の利用者であるという視点に立ってみると、この自衛隊というものが長い宇宙の利用者としての歴史があり、かつ多様な分野でこうした宇宙というものを使ってきていて、別の言い方をすれば長年にわたってですね、 部隊の運用上、あるいは日本の防衛上、宇宙に依存をしてきたという歴史があるわけです。このことをですね、まず踏まえておくということが、これからお話しする、なぜ今、防衛省自衛隊が、例えば宇宙領域把握、SDA に取り組んでいるのかということ、さらには宇宙に関するミッションアシュアランス、機能保証に取り組まなければいけないのかということを理解する上でもですね、非常に重要な基本的な認識として重要な点であるわけです。でこうした点を踏まえまして過去10年のですね進展ということを簡単にお話をしたいわけですけれども、過去10年ということを考えてみますと、もちろん変化ということも起きているわけですね。でこれはやはりこの宇宙基本法ができたということは法的な側面においては非常に大きな転換点であったということでありまして、この宇宙基本法ができたことによって安全保障目的の宇宙利用ということをですね推進していくということができるようになった、そうした中で防衛省自衛隊というものはですね自前の専用の宇宙に関する能力というものを持つ、そうしたことの検討を始めたわけです。実際にそうした検討に基づいてすでに過去10年間を振り返ってみると、いくつかの大きな宇宙に関する能力の整備ということが進んできているわけです。2008年に宇宙基本法ができたわけですけれども、その2年後に閣議決定された防衛計画のその2年後にですね閣議決定された中期防衛力整備計画 MTDP に基づきまして、X バンド防衛通信衛星を整備するということが決まり、そうした2020年の MTDP に基づいてですね今年までに3機のこうした専用の通信衛星というものが打ち上げられて運用中ということでありまして、これらの防衛省が持っている初めての衛星ということになっているわけです。それからですね2013年のことになりますけれども、その当時に同じく閣議決定されました防衛計画の大綱ですね、2013年の防衛計画の大綱において宇宙空間の常続監視を行っていく体制を構築するということが決められたわけでして、そうした方針に基づいてですね過去約10年間の整備を行った上で昨年航空自衛隊が宇宙領域把握に関するミッションを始めたわけです。でなぜ2013年の防衛計画の大綱にそうした宇宙を監視するということがですね盛り込まれたのか、その背景を簡単にご説明しておきますと、もちろん法的な基盤としては宇宙基本法が成立していたということがあるわけですけれども、同時にもう一つの背景としては宇宙利用を取り巻くですねリスク、例えば宇宙ゴミの増加という問題、さらには意図的な妨害能力、例えば中国による衛星破壊実験も2007年にあったということで、そうした意図的あるいは非意図的な宇宙利用に対するリスクの増大ということがあった。さらにはですね特にオバマ政権が始まって以降、米国の国防省というものがこの安全保障分野における同盟国との宇宙協力をより拡大していくという方針の中で日本との間でもこうした宇宙監視に関する協力を積極的に進めていくという方針があったわけです。そうした環境の中で2013年に自衛隊が宇宙監視に取り組むということが決まり、その10年後ようやく2023年に航空自衛隊が宇宙領域把握に関するミッションを始めたわけです。で今年度中にはですね地上配備型の宇宙監視用のレーダーの運用も始まるということで、先ほどボウエン先生の方からダークのお話があったと思うんですけれども、まさにこの今年度運用が開始される日本のこの地上配備型の宇宙監視レーダーというものも基本的には静止軌道にある物体を見るためのレーダーというものが運用されることが決まっているわけです。でこれがですねSDA システムに関する全体像であるわけですけれども、今お話しした通り、今お話しした地上配備型レーダーに加えて 2026会計年度にはSDA 衛星ですね、これを航空自衛隊が打ち上げて運用するということも決まっていますし、もちろん防衛省自衛隊だけでは包括的な SDA というものを取得するということは難しいので、その中で JAXA とのデータ共有、さらには国内外の民間事業者からの SSA 情報のデータ購入、そして具体的には米軍の中でもですね、US スペースコマンドとの情報共有ということを行うことによって、航空自衛隊を中心として、防衛省、日本政府として包括的な宇宙領域把握ということをやるという体制を整備をしている途中にあるわけです。で、今お話ししたような衛星通信、そして宇宙領域把握に関する専用能力の取得に加えまして、やはり大きな点としては、2018年に閣議決定された防衛計画の大綱 NDPG、そして中期防衛力整備計画 MTDP というものがですね、この防衛省自衛隊の宇宙領域での取り組みということを考えてみると、非常に転換点と言ってよいものであったわけですね。というのは私のざっくりとした理解では、防衛省自衛隊にとっての宇宙領域での任務というものは、それまではですね、一つは人工衛星を使って陸海空の部隊運用を情報面で支援する、例えば衛星通信を提供するといったこと、そして2つ目として宇宙領域把握というミッションがあったわけですけれども、この2018年のですねに閣議決定された NDPG と MTDP で防衛省自衛隊にとっても3つ目のですね宇宙領域における任務というものが加わったというふうに理解しております。それがこの宇宙利用の優位の獲得を行っていくと、そのための能力というものをですね整備するということがこのNDPG、MTDP の中で明記されたわけです。その中身というものは一つはミッションアシュアランスを高めていく。これは先ほど冒頭の方で述べた通り、そもそもこれまでもこれからも宇宙に依存しながら自衛隊というものが部隊を運用していくという中で、その一方で宇宙利用に対する脅威が高まっている中でミッションアシュアランスというものを高めていくと同時にですね、必要があれば相手方の指揮統制情報通信というものを妨げる能力というものをですね取得していくということが打ち出されたわけです。で、今お話をした宇宙監視、そして宇宙利用の優位の獲得ということを進めていくためにですね、同じく2018年の NDPG と MTDP の中で明記されたのが宇宙領域専門部隊の発足ということであったわけです。で、そうした方針に基づいて2020年に宇宙作戦隊ができたと、これはわずか約20名の部隊で発足をしたわけですけれども、2024年、今年度のですね、まず具体的には2025年3月までにはですね、約320名まで拡大すると、これは宇宙作戦隊の上級部隊を含めての全体として320名規模ということで、約4年前は20名からスタートした宇宙領域専門部隊というものが4年間で320名まで拡大するという状況まであるわけです。で、今後10年間の状況ということをですね、見通しということを簡単にご説明して私の話を終えたいと思います。で、今お話しした通り、防衛省自衛隊のこの宇宙領域の取り組みということを考えてみると、3つ目の大きなミッションとして宇宙利用の優位の獲得というものが加わったという点では、やはり2018年の NDPG、MTDP というものが大きな転換点であったわけですね。で、他方でそうした防衛省自衛隊の宇宙領域での取り組みの拡大加速ということを考えてみると、それはやはりこの2022年に閣議決定された国家安全保障戦略 NSS、そして同時に閣議決定された国家防衛戦略 NDS、そして防衛力整備計画 DBP、この3つのですね新しいいわゆる戦略3文書というものが重要であるわけです。ご承知のとおり、この2022年のですね国家安全保障戦略というものはその文書に明記されておりますとおり、第二次世界大戦後のですね日本の安全保障政策を実践面から大きく転換するものであるわけですね。その大きな特色というものは長距離ミサイルを中心としたスタンド防衛能力、 そしてそうしたスタンド防衛能力などを活用した反撃能力というものをですね、整備していくということを決断し、そうした反撃能力というものを日本に対する侵攻を抑止する上での鍵として位置づけたということが非常に大きな点であったわけです。そうした中でこの2022年の NSS に何が宇宙関連で盛り込まれたのかというと、これまでもやはりこうした今までのですね、防衛省自衛隊の宇宙での取り組みの拡大において不可欠であった JAXA との協力をより拡大していく、強化していく、そしてまた相手方の指揮統制、情報通信などを妨げる能力の整備を拡充していく、そして先ほど言ったスタンド防衛能力、そしてそれを使った反撃能力の実行可能性を高めるという点で、点と関連して重要な点として、民間宇宙技術の防衛活用と宇宙産業発展の好循環を実現する、そのための一つの柱となるアイテムとして、民間の宇宙技術を活用しながらですね、衛星コンステレーションを作っていくということが NSS の中で明記されたわけです。で最後にですね、そうした新しい戦略3文書に基づいて今どういったですね取り組みが進んでいるのかということを簡単にお話をして私の話を終えたいと思います。で一つはですね、引き続き防衛省自衛隊にとっての宇宙領域でのですね専用の能力の取得ということが進もうとしているわけですね。来年度の概算要求の中に盛り込まれているものであるわけですけれども、大きな目玉としましては、まさにこのスタンドオフ防衛能力の実効性確保ということを行うために、目標の探知・追尾を行うための衛星コンステレーションというものを構築するということ、これをですね、2025会計年度から行っていく。さらにはですね、これも同じく来年度の概算要求に盛り込まれておりますけれども、次の世代のですね、防衛用の通信衛星というものを整備していく。それから宇宙領域把握、そして宇宙利用の優位の獲得を行うための部隊については、宇宙作戦群が今ありますけれども、そのさらに上級部隊である宇宙作戦団というものを発足させ、さらに2027会計年度までにはフランスのようにですね、航空自衛隊を航空宇宙自衛隊に改編するということも計画されているわけです。で最後の点としてはやはりこれまで防衛省自衛隊の中のですね宇宙に関する知見というものは非常に限られてきたものがあった中です。あるわけです。そうした中で他社のですね他省庁であるとか JAXA民間そして同盟国友好国の力を借りることによって急速に防衛省自衛隊はこの宇宙における能力の拡大ということを進めてきたわけですけれども、その方針というものはこれからも変わっていないということで、例えばこの民間のやはり2022年の国家安全保障戦略であるとか宇宙安全保障構想に基づいてですねいかにして民間の宇宙技術を使っていくのか、また商業宇宙サービスを使っていくのかということが大きな課題となっており、それが重点事項になっておりますし、また同盟国友好国との協力ということをですね拡大していくということも決まっているわけです。特にその中で象徴的な出来事としては昨年末にですねついに日本も連合宇宙作戦イニシアチブに加入するということが実現したということで、これからはもちろんアメリカとのこうした宇宙における作戦に関する同盟協力ということも進んでいくでしょうし、プラスですねこうした連合宇宙作戦イニシアチブに加入している他の有志国との協議の機会ということも増えてくるということが予期されるわけです。以上、簡単ではありますけれども、日本の防衛宇宙政策のこれまでと今後約10年間の見通しということでお話をさせていただきました。ありがとうございます。
福島主検ありがとうございました。 福島主権からは、実は自衛隊は50年以上にわたって宇宙を利用してきたというその事実をご指摘いただくとともに、過去10年においては特にですね、その宇宙におけるその優位性を確立するという観点で、その妨害能力の強化も含めた整備というのを進めてきたということ、そして今後10年という観点でいうと、ターゲティング用のそのコンステレーションの確立だとか、それから自衛隊の組織としては宇宙作戦団の設立、そういった方向性が存在しているということと、アメリカやその同志国、さらには企業も含めたその協力関係の強化というものを目指していくであろうというお話をいただいたかと思います。それでは3つ目の発表でございますけれども、フランス戦略研究財団 FRS 所長のジャビエール・パスコ先生にお願いしております。パスコ先生はエコールポリテクニック研究院 FRS 主任研究員を経て2016年から FRS の所長を務められております。本日のご発表テーマはフランスの軍事宇宙政策であります。それではパスコ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I would like to thank NIDS for inviting me. I don't have slides with me. I would like to give you an overview of the French organization, maybe using three moments. First time would be, as my predecessor, look back to history, because we need to understand where we come from to understand where we are today. And then, of course, an overview of the current state of the French space military program. And also, in the last moment, the approach of a diplomatic aspect of all this. So very quick look back to history. Sometimes it's not so well known, but France has been the third nation to independently launch a satellite into space. And just this fact recalls the long-time interest paid by France to space. And this has not come as a surprise. With an accent put in the 50s on the quest for strategic autonomy, space would become, along with the mastering of nuclear energy, the spearhead of the post-Second World War recovery period in this highly characteristic Gaullist years, named after the first president of the Fifth Republic, General de Gaulle. And the development of nuclear technologies would not only mean the condition of a future national energetic independence, but also the acquisition of a sovereign deterrence force. And all that precisely along the same lines at the development of rocketry technologies that would mean creating from scratch a product line suited to completing the deployment of the deterrent force and to accessing space. So even for its symbolic value only, military space was continuously put at the foreground of national public investments and has benefited all along of the special attention devoted to nuclear deterrence by the successive presidencies up to today. This close relationship between space and nuclear has not been challenged and may even gain strength, in fact, at moments when the credibility of the deterrence needs to be reinforced. This increased and close relationship between space and nuclear, it really came at an apex, I would say, a few years after Ronald Reagan pronounced his strategic defense initiative speech. And you had the launch in 1986 of the Helios program. It was the first series of Earth observation satellites devoted to military observation and targeting. And it was speaking volumes in this respect. The new focus on space systems themselves, beyond the sole rocketry activity, would seal the common destiny of space and nuclear in France to this date. And if these new developments may have been merely conceived as a nice-to-have capability in the deterrence context, along with the Syracuse series of telecommunication satellites, and at first, as it's been documented, there was an initial project in 1977 called SAMRO, the predecessor of Helios, that was cancelled then because Syracuse, the telecommunication satellite, a bit like in the UK, by the way, was privileged at the time. And Helios just came in 1986 as a second moment in this relationship of space and nuclear. So France quickly became the sole European power eager to launch a large portfolio of military space programs, from space launchers to specifically designed space systems. French military satellites, and this is the second historical step, I would say, have progressively appeared as crucial elements in the French general strategic and military posture. And in a bit of a parallel with the US use of space system, in a parallel evolution, the fact that France started to use satellite to support its military operation in the 90s with the Gulf War, and then in the 2000s with repeated operations in North Africa, in the Sahel. You had Operation Serval in 2013, Operation Barkhane in 2014. It set the context of an ambitious counter-terrorist policy and reinforced this feeling of the usefulness of space. And we had an important date in this respect, which is 2008. In 2008, we had a Defense and Security White Book that created a new strategic function, the fifth strategic function in the French doctrine, which was called knowledge and anticipation. The point was that after the events of 2001, the fact was acknowledged that there was to have a new intelligence and new capabilities to be set up to better detect weak signals that would create security/terrorist/military difficulties. And this knowledge and anticipation function was really foundational for the whole change of the military space policy in France. This was undoubtedly another national space moment, calling this time for an increased use of space systems for intelligence and combat operations support. This would mean the development of new capabilities meant to answer part of the new military needs, including, for example, the beginnings of early warning experiments. We had a program called Spiral, which was an experimental program meant to test sensors in the field of missile detection. And we had another program, also an experimental one, called Essaim, and Essaim was meant to be a RF interception program, a SIGINT program. Essaim was pursued. It was transformed into another one, which was called ELISA. And ELISA will now give the floor, I would say, to another one called Celeste. So this was a continuous effort. So the Helios family also had to evolve at this time towards more capable satellites, both ensuring the strategic monitoring mission, that's one thing, but also feeding the armed forces with imagery and information more actionable on the battlefields. And this was really new for France because, as I told you, the relationship between nuclear and space, we had some sort of a strategic-oriented space and nothing more than that. So this was new. So we had this change of perspective, and an important part of the new strategy, so we had, just before that, in 2008, because of this knowledge and anticipation function, the creation of a new command, the Joint Space Command. The Joint Space Command was the first step created to streamline the organization of the military and the armed forces towards a more efficient space-oriented structure. But it was joint. The point was that it was important to keep in mind that the effects on the ground were the ultimate objectives, and not so much the creation of a space force at the time. This was based on the increased dependency on space systems, mostly for France, because it had also military operations abroad. There was this perception that space was needed to really organize and plan military operation. So that was really the focus on the combat operation. And then after that, we had this moment between 2008 and 2019. This increased dependency make people realize that space could be a vulnerability. Space could become a target. And this has been a slow awareness in the military structures that the organization, the capabilities would have to evolve. And in 2017 already, there was a President Macron strategic review of defense and security, and I just can read some words here. It says, outer space is also a domain of strategic and military rivalry, a domain of confrontation where some states can be tempted to use force to deny access or threaten to damage orbiting system. This dimension must be addressed in the short term through additional investment in human and physical resources. This dates back 2017. In 2 years after that, in 2019, there was the publication of the first space defense strategy, French space defense strategy. And an important part of this new strategy has been focused on the new space environment, including both threats and risks. So it goes from the effects of space on the Earth to the effects of space in space. And for the first time in France, future military uses of space have been evoked to go beyond the classical Earth-oriented applications, Earth observations, telecommunications, PNT, timing, whatever. And there was a speech, for example, from the then Ministry of Defense, Florence Parly, which underlines this new concept of active defense in space. It's been very much, I would say, commented. It stressed the need for France to get equipped with specific space weapons, even if this expression does not appear as such in the speech, neither in the speech nor in the strategy itself. But this French announcement about setting a new concept of active defense may have looked like a form of political gamble at the time. It was more like a work in progress, in fact. The speech first of all notes the trend towards greater militarization and acknowledged at the same time that the time has come to try to prevent it. The time for sanctuary space is over, it seems, and this is regrettable. That's really the point that the government made at the time. And the strategy seems to acknowledge it, but in fact it also implicitly recognized it, of course. So there was a direct consequence to this, the transformation of the Joint Space Command created in 2008 into a Space Command. The rebranding of an Air and Space Force, the French Air and Space Force, because the Space Command is under the organic control of the Air Force. This command was not intended to become a sui generis space force, just like in the US. The institutional effects of this reorganization were highly symbolic, with an expanding scope, including the ultimate function of controlling military satellites. The very creation of this new command signaled the evolution of the functional relationship between the armed forces and satellite capabilities. This is very important because the legitimacy behind the creation of this new space command was directly related to the fact that the uniformed military people had to control satellites because space would become a war-fighting domain at some point. And until then, CNES people in Toulouse were and still are in charge of governmental satellites. So of course, this is creating legal issues, and this meant that this was one of the reason of the creation of this creation of this Space Command. So just to give you a few hints about what means active defense. Active defense, and I read there the strategy, military space operations previously Earth-centered must also now be directed towards space and seek under all circumstances to preserve freedom of access to space and action in space, discourage and thwart action by any ill-intentioned third party, and they span various passive and active measures relating to the prevention, to prevention, taking a comprehensive approach, diplomatic, media, economic, legal, etc., the resilience of all space assets, and the defense in space of our space assets. So this is what you find in the strategy, and it says that active and passive measures to protect satellites whose placement in orbit is already scheduled will be stepped up. In addition, a genuine capability for action in space will be acquired by 2030, drawing on feedbacks from demonstrators developed under the Military Programming Law Act 2019-2025. So precisely this is what you see now, and the current status of the French space program is very much connected to the programming law, in fact, which is the budgetary act to feed the military for the 5 next years. And in the latest one, 2024-2030, the French Military Programming Act, it says, strengthening France's actions in space requires renewed space observation and listening capabilities, enhanced space domain awareness capabilities to detect suspicious or aggressive acts in space, technologies to protect our assets through active defense, particularly in low Earth orbit. To this end, it will provide for the creation of a command control communication computing center for space operations, it's called that C4OS, with the means to pilot actions to, in, and from space, and the programming of patrol guard satellites, YODA. So there is a geostationary program called YODA, which is meant to monitor the surroundings of key assets, key military assets, and give a view of the situation then. And they're talking about also in-orbit lasers with a program called FLAM, and ground-based action with a program called bloomless laser. And this capability will be operational before the end of the decade. So it's a rather ambitious portfolio, mainly based on experiments that indeed have been fielded just now, in fact, just for you to know. YODA program has been about testing the deployment of some sort of Sentinel, I told you, or Guardian Angel satellites aimed to detect, monitor hostile moves around national military satellites in geo orbit. And there will be a more operational, the operational program will be called EGID, and EGID will be the operational version of this experimental YODA program. But maybe you've heard of that. Last month, in November, there's been the announcement of another program called Toutatis. It's named after a Gallic god. But it means something very, very smart. I don't remember exactly what. So also the official presentation here, it will use 2 nano satellites in low Earth orbit to validate operational defense scenario. The first demonstration will put into action a complete chain of knowledge and reactions in the face of attempted space interference. It's been funded by the Innovative Defense Agency for Innovation. It's under the DGA, the procurement agency. And there's also the launch of another program called simulation, to simulate the capture of dangerous space objects in low Earth orbits. It's been notified to a startup called DARC. It's been founded in 2022. And it's a startup that's specialized on quick reaction in space and maneuver and action on satellites, and especially on debris. And this will be also studied for possibly defense mission. So it's very, I would say, lively, even effervescent at some point, with not a big money, rather small money, but rather it's really paralleling the building of this new Space Command, and the Space Command will be installed in Toulouse, very close to CNES, in fact. And all these programs are envisioned to be operational at a 2030 horizon in this area. So, of course, and that will be my last point. Of course, this is the military aspect of it, and indeed, this active defense notion must be accompanied by a diplomatic context in which this can have a reasonable chance to exist in a way that doesn't trigger overreaction. And so that's why if you look at what the French have pushed during the last, let's say, decade about the global discussions on collective security in space, you have a constant French position that calls for greater cooperation and transparency. The point really in this particular, and this is what we hear constantly from the authorities, the point in this space defense strategy is really to make sure that increasing this notion of active defense in space must be accompanied by, there's this notion that it's legitimate for any country to defend its space assets. And then if we recognize that to ourselves and to others, we must accompany that with more transparency and a mechanism at least that remains to be defined to prevent miscalculations or escalation possibilities. And that's clearly the stance that has been taken by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France in parallel to this defense strategy. By first, as soon as 2008, defending, for example, the initiative by the European Union of an international code of conduct on space, which has been ill-fated. And after that, for example, the support in August 2020 to brought to the United Kingdom resolution on responsible behaviors. All this is really meant to accompany this beefed up military capability with a parallel, very strong diplomatic, proactive policy. I will stop there. What is really studied is what could be a transparency mechanism for space. We don't have the answer yet. It has to be, of course, debated internationally. Some model exists in the field, for example, of the proliferation of ballistic missiles, etc. You have code of conduct that could be interesting mechanism for creating a platform of exchange, for creating transparency. So all this should be pushed and should be further explored. That's part of this twofold policy that I would say, and I will stop there.
パスコ先生、ありがとうございました。パスコ先生からは、フランスの宇宙開発がその戦略的自立性を重視する考え方プラスその独自の核戦力の強化というものと密接に関わってきていたというその歴史的な背景と、それから90年代2000年代あたりでその軍事上のオペレーションにおいて宇宙の重要性というものが認識され、その活用が進んだということ、そしてその結果としてその宇宙へのその軍事の依存というものが課題依存、そしてそれがもたらす脆弱性というのが課題となって、それに対応するということが今の課題になっているということがお話があったと思います。またそのためにアクティブディフェンスというコンセプトについてのご説明、それからそれを実現する上での最近のプログラム、そして最後にその不必要なエスカレーションを避けるという観点での外交上の努力の必要性というものについてご指摘いただいたかと思います。最後のご発表でございますけれども、オーストラリア戦略政策研究所レジデントシニアフェローのラジェシュワリ・ラジャゴパラン先生にお願いしております。ラジャゴパラン先生は今年7月まではインドのオブザーバー研究財団安全保障戦略技術研究所の所長でいらっしゃいました。本日のご発表のタイトルはインドの国家安全保障宇宙政策であります。では、ラジャゴパラン先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think post-lunch sessions are always a challenge, and being the last speaker, either everybody is tired or everybody has woken up from a siesta. So, either ways, I'll try and keep it light and try and thank you in advance for your attention. So let me focus on how India's national security space journey has been. But I'll start by saying that India's space program has been around for about nearly 6 decades now. And as a developing country with limited resources, India began its program with an initial focus on the social and economic development of the country. But in recent decades, I would say it has had to reorient and expand its space program with a focus on security needs more than ever in the past. Some of the key factors driving the change in Indian approach to space include changing threat scenario within the space domain, and the broader shifting global balance of power, which is evident in the Indo-Pacific region, regional power balance as well. Looking at the progression of India's space program and an approach, India's space program has gone through some transformative changes in recent years. If one were to compare the earlier Indian opposition, which was vehemently critical of the US Strategic Defense Initiative and the anti-satellite tests conducted by the US and USSR in the 70s and 80s. But India's position has evolved in a way transitioning from a morality and principle-based position to one that is conditioned by pragmatism and national security interests. India's position today is a lot more calibrated and considered and aligns more with its broader approach to global security norms itself, which has been, again, seen certain amount of loosening up. India has had to expand the space agenda with new consideration from a national security angle. China's gaining of greater proficiency in space is something that has put many spacefaring powers, including India, Japan, and the US, on notice. Introduction of anti-satellite weapons in the Indo-Pacific neighborhood by China in January 2007, and China's repeated tests add to the regional anxieties and competition. Irrespective of the logic, countries in the Indo-Pacific neighborhood perceive these as threatening to their own security and destabilizing in the regional context. The baggage of history and the great power politics in the region are accelerating the security dilemma in the region. ASAT weapons are inherently destabilizing in nature, and China's ASAT test pushed a new debate within India on how India must approach outer space, including the need to develop new counter-space capabilities to protect its own assets in outer space. India's growing security concerns, especially those related to China, including an array of counter-space capabilities, appear to be driving much of the new focus on India's space program. So now let me come to the context. There's a competitive Asian landscape. There are three established space powers, India, China, and Japan, who have actively collaborated with other space powers, including the US, France, and Russia. But intra-regional collaboration has been fairly minimal or nil. Also, one cannot overlook the fact that there are two regional space organizations, APSCO under the Chinese leadership and the APRSAF under the Japanese leadership, each with their own respective member countries, and there exists no mechanism for cooperation between these two regional initiatives. This demonstrates the competitive tone and tenor of the two groupings and their broader goals within the regional broader security context. Many Asian space players develop their space programs with an economic than security agenda, but are increasingly making crucial departures with the security environment becoming not so benign. There is a sense that inaction could cost them with implications for their national security. In both India and Japan, the changes are becoming more evident, with the two developing certain military profile to their space programs and developing appropriate technologies and institutions to make efficient use of space in the national security context. Both countries also collaborate in the bilateral context, but also within the regional and multilateral context with a focus on space security. Coming to India's national security-driven space progression, there has been an overall expansion of India's space program, but its national security dimensions have become quite significant in the past decade, given the growing military and security drivers in the Indo-Pacific. Considering the emerging security trends, India and many of its new security partners in the region will continue on this path to build up their deterrence capabilities in space, even as deterrence in space is yet to become a state policy. Lack of substantial multilateral negotiations can accelerate the pace towards deterrence in space, something that can be avoided, but we are losing time. India has been a bit slow in bringing about the policy changes, at least formally, but it has been active in terms of the various capability requirements which have been practically beneficial. For instance, some of India's earliest military satellites, such as the RESAT series, have been useful in augmenting the Indian military situational awareness. The RESAT series of satellites with synthetic aperture radar have been particularly beneficial to the Indian military. These gained greater traction in the context of the Mumbai terrorist attacks in November 2008, when India acutely felt the need for all-weather surveillance satellites that could provide India's security agencies with updates, especially on its eastern and western front. Given this need to maintain persistent visibility in the neighborhood, India has launched a number of dual-use satellites that have relevance in the context of India's national security. Currently, India has only less than 15 such satellites, which include Cartosat, RISAT, Eros satellites. But in the next 5 years, India plans to launch a total of 50 military and dual-use satellites equipped with a range of sensors and radars which should strengthen India's eyes on the neighborhood. In terms of dedicated military satellite space assets, one of the first dedicated military satellites that India developed was the GSAT-7 for the Indian Navy in August 2013, meant to boost India's space-based maritime communications and electronic intelligence. Since then, India has developed a series of communication satellites for the other two services, including the Army and the Navy, in order to have enhanced and secure communication, but also to facilitate better coordination in the context of military operations. India has also developed a smaller version of the GPS for its navigational requirements called the NAVIC. In addition to stepping up its technological wherewithal, India has also established necessary institutions for effective coordination between the civilian and military agencies, thus paving way for seamless utilization of space capabilities. One of the first institutions was the Integrated Space Cell under the Integrated Defense Services Headquarters of the Ministry of Defense in 2010, which was considered as an essential baby step in creating effective coordination between the Department of Space and the Indian Armed Forces, as well as to generate a common understanding of the emerging space security threats that India might face. It was an important baby step, but did not really evolve in terms of effectiveness and delivery. Next, among the three services, the Navy took the lead in establishing the Indian Navy's Assistant Chief of Naval Staff, meant for communications, space, and network-centric operations in 2012. And in 2015, it seemed like the Indian government was on to more institutional innovations, with the Ministry of Defense said to be finalizing the final steps towards the establishment of 3 tri-service commands: the Cyber Command under the Indian Navy, Aerospace Command under the Indian Air Force, and the Special Operations Command under the Indian Army. However, the government established only 3 interim agencies: the Defense Cyber Agency, the Defense Space Agency, and the Special Operations Division, and the Defense Space Agency was established towards the end of 2018. Many, again, consider this as an institutional innovation that might lead to a full-fledged aerospace command, which has been a demand from the armed forces for more than 2 decades. But it is 6 years since the DSA was set up, and the integration of military and space and military affairs have become greater, but there is no sign of a full-fledged command as yet. Coming to India's changing policy approach to space, India announced a national space policy for the first time in 2023, but it has been fairly limited and has several lacunae, especially from a space security perspective. The 2023 policy appears to be more like a guidance document for industry startups, new space industries, to engage the Indian space establishment. Looking at the rapidly changing space security scenario, the Indian government lost an opportunity to outline its vision on space security issues and its perspective on how India plans to counter the growing space security threats. Even as India has not spelled out space security policy, there have been subtle changes over the years in how India has approached space in the security context. India in the past decades had adopted a doctrinaire approach or a sanctuary school of thought to space security issues, which reaffirmed that space must be used for peaceful purposes alone, and strongly opposed militarization and weaponization of space. And accordingly, as mentioned earlier, India was a vocal critic of the US and USSR throughout the Cold War years because of their military space program, as well as their repeated ASAT tests. The Indian position, of course, made sense at that point of time, given that India had no such capabilities and therefore criticized those who possessed them. But India's position began to see some important changes in the early 2000s. One can attribute many reasons for the subtle changes in India's approach, but an important consideration was that of India's desire to integrate with the global non-proliferation architecture and to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, which was the identity in the preceding decades. A second important factor was the changing security environment in India's neighborhood, wherein Pakistan was the initial focus, but by the late 1990s, the threat had shifted to China. And the China-Pakistan partnership that spanned a number of different areas, including Beijing's transfer of small and medium-range missiles to Pakistan, and the broader missile proliferation in the region were particularly concerning. All of these became imperatives for India to adopt a new thinking on space and missile defense issues, which led to a softening of India's rhetoric considerably, and its overall stand on India military space and missile defense issues became more considered and nuanced. While India's space policy approach towards space has evolved considerably since the 70s and 80s, it is yet to embrace the full change and goes back every now and then to its old comfortable position that space is meant for peaceful purposes alone. Given the politicized nature of space debates, and despite the Indian ASAT demonstration, India sometimes tends to hold a moralistic argument on space security issues. This is evident in the global governance aspects of space security. In fact, India is yet to fully endorse the political instruments such as transparency and confidence building measures. India still continues to hold the view that they are good supplementary measures, but they cannot replace the legally binding instruments. Nevertheless, I would argue that there has been a gradual shift on India's approach to space, reflective of a certain amount of pragmatism and the growing security considerations. Coming to how India will be dealing with space security threats, again, India's space security environment has been worsening for about 2 decades now. China's first successful ASAT test in 2007 was a wake-up call to India on the kind of threats in its neighborhood that India should be prepared to address. This, in fact, prompted the Indian establishment across the board, the political, technical, and military leadership, to discuss and debate on how India should develop the means to protect its own assets. In a unique fashion, there was a consensus view that emerged, which said that India must develop appropriate measures as a way to deter any attacks on its space assets. The government then sanctioned the research and development of India's own ASAT capability, even though it did not decide on when to have that demonstrated capability. The decision to demonstrate India's ASAT capability was taken by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in March 2019. The decision was possibly conditioned by India's experience in the nuclear domain with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. India wanted to ensure that it had a demonstrated ASAT capability before any NPT-like global mechanism on space security came about, given that the 3 established space powers, US, Russia, and China, had already demonstrated ASAT capabilities, and it was possibly in their interest to prevent others from conducting ASAT tests. India was also possibly driven to assume that given the state of multilateralism and the worsening great power relation, strengthening or establishing new global governance measures was not going to be a reality, and therefore felt the need to have its own capabilities in place in order to deter others from blowing up India's space assets. India's ASAT test was, again, not an easy decision, given that it was walking away from a well-established, decades-old position against militarization and weaponization of space. It would have been also strange a decision because India was a vocal critic of the US and the Soviet for their space programs and the military and the ASAT tests. But ultimately, the national security considerations became the essential drivers for India to take the decision on its ASAT demonstration. There are, of course, questions around the deterrence value of the Indian ASAT in deterring China, but for the time being, it appears to have been useful in sending a political message to China. Meanwhile, the Indian Defense Research and Development community appears to be working on a number of different technologies like directed energy weapons, lasers, EMP, co-orbital weapons, and so on and so forth. The Indian Air Force, like my previous speaker said, they're also gearing to rename itself as the Indian Air and Space Force in its efforts to make it a credible aerospace power. One, however, needs to exercise a bit of caution while reading into these statements. From bureaucratic politics to gaining access to funds, there are a number of such factors that can influence these statements. This is, however, not to suggest that the Indian establishment is not worried about the worsening space security conditions. In fact, it used to be a concern that the Indian establishment may not fully come to understand and appreciate the space security issues and the urgent measures that are required to counter them. But today, it no longer appears to be the case. So like I said, China's ASAT test in 2007 was a game-changer moment as far as India's space security thinking is concerned. In fact, the Defense Space Agency that was established in 2018 conducted its first military space exercise called Antariksha Abhyas in 2024 in Delhi in November 2024, conducted with the goal of further integrating space in India's military operations. Speaking on the occasion, Chief of Defense Staff General Chauhan said, space is now the critical enabler of India's defense and security apparatus. In fact, in recent years, the military leadership has become quite vocal on the use of space in the context of national security and military operation. The kind of hesitancy that prevailed in the past is not there anymore. Back in 2019, just a few months after the ASAT demonstration, India also held a tabletop wargaming called INT-SpaceX, bringing together the different stakeholders, including the Indian military and the scientific establishment. And so more than a decade after the Chinese ASAT test, India seems to be a lot bolder and somewhat considered in terms of its approach to space security. Emerging space security partnerships, and I want to end with that. So while China and its space security prowess has gained greater traction in India's space security policy debates, India is also looking to solidify partnerships with like-minded countries who share similar perspectives on the growing space threats and also in how they might deal with those threats. In this regard, India has gone on to establish as well as strengthen space security partnership with each of the Quad countries as a whole, but as well as with individual Quad countries as well as and France. It's also interesting to note that India's first space security dialogue was with the US that began in 2015, and thereafter India entered into a similar dialogue format with Japan in 2019 and with France in 2013. In India's earlier approach to space, one would have envisioned that India would be having similar such conversations with countries like Soviets or even France, but not with the US and Japan. Thus, the changed space security conditions have driven a certain amount of pragmatism to acknowledge the like-mindedness in terms of threat perceptions in the space domain and the possible countries that India can work in addressing some of the space security threats. Similarly, at a minilateral level, the Quad as a whole is engaged in some sort of consultations on norms of responsible behavior and regulations, which has been an emphasis on, which has seen an emphasis on China's counter space capabilities and behavior. Again, this is interesting and important development, especially from an Indian perspective, because traditionally India partnered with the non-aligned G21 countries in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which insists on legally binding verifiable mechanism as far as global governance measures were concerned. So for India to be engaging in a smaller grouping, exclusive grouping such as the Quad, and collaborate on, even to consult on possible space norms is an important departure from its earlier approach. But China's aggressive behavior across terrestrial geopolitics and political issues, as well as its inventory of counter-space capabilities, have driven India to shed some of the previous hesitancies and develop like-minded partnerships that could also be a soft deterrent measure. For India and its many other security partners, it's also a way to develop technological responses to the multitude of space security threats by building better resilience and redundancy and thus minimizing disruptions and vulnerabilities. Having said that, there are areas that India needs to prioritize and be able to call out bad and irresponsible behavior in space as and when it happens. That India abstained from voting on the UN resolution to ban destructive anti-satellite weapon tests in December 2022 was a mistake that could have been avoided. But in recent voting on the US, Japan, Argentina-sponsored resolution in the UN, India voted in favor of the resolution that called for outer space to be kept free from the nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And of course, it is true that Outer Space Treaty of 1967 already prohibits placement of weapons in WMD in space, but given the trends that we see today, wherein states are increasingly breaking norms without any impunity, it appears that norms, whether they exist through legal or political measures, need to be reiterated and recommitted by states. Geopolitical competition in space has driven to such an extent where states are willing to forego their own commitments in place for achieving narrow political goals. To conclude, India is yet to have a comprehensive national space policy, but despite that, there has been an appreciation for the increasing stresses that space domain is confronted with. This is reflected in the Indian capability developments as well as the institutional innovations to adopt and to adapt to the changing space security conditions. This has also brought about the appreciation for developing and nurturing space security partnership with a number of like-minded partners, including the US, Japan, France, and Australia. Some of the shift that India has shown, such as the Quad consultations on space norms, will likely pick up momentum in the coming years as space security developments appear to be on a slippery slope. but there are areas that India needs to give up in terms of its ambiguity and adopt a proactive approach in countering growing space security threats. Let me stop here, and I'll be happy to hear your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
ラジャゴパラン先生、ありがとうございました。先生からはインドの宇宙開発というのが非常にこの中国からの脅威というものに対応するという観点で牽引されているということ、それからその宇宙状況認識能力の強化をはじめとして宇宙能力の強化にも今努めているということ、そして最後に国際的な協力、特にその同志国との協力が重要だというようなお話をいただいたかと思います。続きまして討論に移りたいと思います。第2セッションの討論者は東京大学公共政策大学院教授で地経学研究所長でもある鈴木一人先生にお願いしております。先生は筑波大学准教授、北海道大学教授を経て現職に就かれております。まず鈴木先生から余命のご発表に対するですね、コメントおよび質問をいただき、各発表者からそれぞれご回答いただく形で進めていきたいと思います。それでは鈴木先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。ただいまご紹介に預かりました東京大学並びに地経学研究所の鈴木でございます。今日このパネルに並んでいらっしゃる方々、私はもう過去に何度もいろんな形で学ばせていただいた方々で、それぞれ大変な知見をお持ちの方々、午前中にお話しされたスコット・ペース先生、青木先生ももちろんですけれども、非常になんていうんですかね、私としては光栄で、かつなんていうんですかね、今までの勉強してきたことをここでまたコメントさせていただくという非常に光栄に預かっているなという印象があって、このパネルを組織された、またこのイベントを組織された防衛研究所並びに福島さん、福島研究官には大変感謝いたしております。で今日のこのテーマ、安全保障目的とした宇宙利用の、各国政策というこういう、テーマだったわけですけれども、4つの国、それぞれがですね、いずれも歴史的なこの経緯の中で、この安全保障目的の宇宙利用というのが生まれたというこの歴史的な積み上げと、それによって作り出されるコンテキストがやはり非常に重要だということが今回示されたのではないかというふうに思います。もちろんそれぞれですね、皆さん歴史でもありますけれども、しかし各国のこの安全保障目的の宇宙利用を考えるときに、いくつか多分決定的なファクターというのがあって、一つは誰を敵とみなすかっていう問題ですね。最後のラジゴポランさんの報告、普段ラジって呼んでるのでラジと呼ばせていただきますが、ラジの報告では、いわゆる誰が敵であるかというこの中国の名前がよく出てきたのに対し、フランスの場合は、どちらかというとですね、この同盟国の中における戦略的自立っていう問題が出てきたり、またイギリスの場合はこのアメリカとEU というかアメリカとヨーロッパの間に挟まれたジレンマっていうこういうところから決められていて、どちらかというと敵によって決められていないというところが結構重要で、日本はさらに言うともともと歴史的に作り上げられてきた憲法、そして平和主義という国内的な要素によって規定されてくるというこういった違いから考えると、宇宙における安全保障上の利用の特徴として敵を対象にしたものではないっていうところに非常に重要な特徴があるんではないかなというふうに思います。でもう一つのやっぱり特徴が制度の問題だと思っていて、例えばそれこそインドの場合はですね、長らくこの、DRDO ですとか、こうした 防衛機関というものの宇宙への関与っていうのが非常に小さかった。それは日本も同様で、防衛省自衛隊というのは2008年の宇宙基本法でこの認められるまで、予算がつく利用することができたというのが福島研究官のお話でしたけれども、同時にですね開発ですとか運用という点では2008年の宇宙基本法を待つしかなかったと。で他方面白いのは、イギリスの場合はこの同盟の中でアメリカとの関係の中で、自らの自立性を、積極的に求めてこなかったのに対し、それに対して、このフランスはですね自らのこの制度をきちんと作っていくことに、非常に不信して、でそれはフランス一国だけではなく、今日あまり話になりませんでしたけれども、ヨーロッパレベルで、これも NATO だけではなく、EU の例えば、欧州防衛機関ですね IIDA ですとか、今EU の中にもですねこの宇宙の安全保障に関わるようなポスト、制度というのができてきているという、こういう意味ではこの制度という流れの中で、それぞれの国はこのそれぞれのコンテキストに合わせて制度を作ってきたという、こういう特徴があるのかなというふうに思っています。で大変興味深いのは、今日午前中にアメリカのお話があり、またインド、それからフランス、イギリスともですね、実は皆さん核兵器国であるという、こういう国であるのに対し日本はそうではないっていう、ここもこの安全保障と宇宙の関係のところでは非常に重要な意味を持ってくるんだと思います。もちろんそれは、核兵器のデリバリーシステムとしてのミサイル、ロケットの開発ということが宇宙開発を進めていくドライビングフォースになっていったという、こういう側面がある一方で、また戦略的に、つまり例えばそのターゲティングですとか、他国からのミサイル防衛等のですね、この防衛に関するところでもやはり宇宙というのが不可欠であるという、こういう観点で、この観点に日本もこの関わるようになってきたのがこの2008年以降のこのもともとその日本のミサイル防衛というのは、おそらく1990年代の終わりぐらいから、特に北朝鮮のミサイルの脅威というのがあって、ミサイル防衛の導入というのが進められたわけですけれども、しかしそれに宇宙、これまではアメリカのその、早期警戒衛星等にこの依存していたわけですが、その早期警戒衛星等に、ではなく自らの能力を高めていかなければならないという理解が進んでいったのはこの2008年以降ではないのかなというふうに思っています。でもう一つこの宇宙、今日、お話の中ではそれほどたくさん出てこなかったんですが、やはりリーダーシップっていうのもこの各国の宇宙を決めていく重要なポイントになるのかなというふうに思っています。インドの中ではラジの報告の中ではモディ首相の名前が出てきましたし、グザビエの報告の中ではドゴールっていうこの人が出てきた。こうしたやはりこのそれぞれの国のコンテキストと制度っていうものをシェイプしていく、形成していくようなリーダーシップを誰が発揮するか、どういう思想によってそれを発揮するかというのがこの各国の宇宙政策を決めていく大きなファクターになっている。おそらくこれは福島研究官の話の中では、そこがですね、おそらく2008年の宇宙基本法を作った、例えば当時中心になって動かれていた河村武夫さん、元官房長官ですけれども、こういった方であったりとか、場合によってはですね、イギリスの場合は安全保障の問題っていうのはかなり早い段階でこのシェイプされてきたという部分はあると思うんですけれども、例えばですね宇宙開発全体でいうと、やはりサッチャー首相ですとか、そういった方々はかなりやっぱり大きな役割を果たしたのかなというふうに理解をしています。でこうしたこの リーダーシップという観点で言うとですね、やはり最後に、ラジも話をされていたやっぱり国際協力、誰と組むのかどう組むのかっていうこういう問題がやはり各国の宇宙政策においては重要な問題になってくるんですが、それぞれバイラテラルマルチラテラルなコミットメントしている国々ですけれども、そこでですねちょっと時間も限られてますので皆さんに質問をしたいと思っていて、やはり重要なポイントは今この時期にどういうコンテキストでどういうリーダーシップが働いていてどういう制度が作られるかっていうのがこれ重要なポイントになるわけですけれども、一つはまずはどういうリーダーシップという点でいうと、やはりアメリカのトランプさん、今度トランプ氏が次期アメリカの大統領になることによってそれぞれの国は何らかの影響を受けるであろうというふうに思います。とりわけ安全保障利用の場合、この、誰が敵かっていうときに、アメリカにとって、その戦略的な、競争相手というのは、間違いなく、中国になるわけですけれども、その中国とアメリカの間のこの、競争ないしは戦略的対立の中で果たして、トランプ氏はどういう戦略を取り、そしてそれはそれぞれの国にどういった影響が起きるのか、もちろんその、いわゆるフォーマルな同盟国としての、イギリス、日本、それから、フランスと、またその、ある種のこのライクマインデッドという形でインドということであると思いますけれども、このリーダーシップの問題っていうのがこれからの宇宙の方向性をどう変えていくのかということで、もう一つコンテキストという観点でいうとやはり重要になってくるのはこの商業化、コマーシャライゼーションだと思います。今、この安全保障目的の宇宙利用に関して、これまでは、先ほどクザビエの報告の中でもかなり、そのフランスがどういうプログラムをやってきたかという、この国家主導型のプログラムっていうものが中心にお話しされてきましたけれども、そしてそれは多くの国で、例えばイギリスの場合、スカイネットですとか、日本の場合はその情報収集衛星、その通信衛星、きらめき等があるわけですけれども、これから問題になってくるのは、これらがどんどんこの商業衛星に置き換えられていくのかどうか、そしてその場合、この安全保障上の宇宙利用の在り方というのはどう変わっていくのか、つまり国家の関与の仕方は単に既存のこのサービスを買うだけ、つまりサービス調達をするだけなのか、それとも技術開発も含めて国家はリーダーシップを発揮して、そしてその方向、安全保障上の宇宙利用の方向づけをしていくものなのかどうかというのが2点目の質問です。で、3つ目はその商業化を進めていくやっぱりイーロン・マスクという人物がいて、この人物は今後多分アメリカの、そして日本の、インドの、フランスの、イギリスのこの宇宙開発に非常に大きく影響してくるだろうと。とりわけ彼が今トランプ政権に非常に近いということが、この商業化と宇宙利用ということにどういうような影響を与えるのかという、こういう点が重要になってくると思います。本当はもう聞きたいことは山ほどあるんですが、多分時間も限られてますので、この3つですね、トランプさんが出てきたこと、商業化が進んできたことと、それに伴うイーロン・マスクの存在というこの3つについて皆さんのご見解をそれぞれの国における影響を聞かせていただければと思います。
鈴木先生、ありがとうございました。ですね、第2セッションはあと2分で終わらなければいけないということでございます。ですね、もしよろしければ、今鈴木先生からいただいたご質問に対するご回答は、次の第3セッションに少し持ち越してですね、そちらで最初、4名の先生方からお答えいただいた後、その次の討論に入っていただければと思いますけれども、それでよろしいでしょうか。はい。ありがとうございました。では申し訳ございませんけれども、この時点でですね、第2セッションは一旦終了ということにしたいと思います。質問の受付もですね、これにて終了させていただきたいと存じます。 で、第3セッションについてはですね、15時35分から開始ということでございますので、それまでにお戻りいただければ幸いでございます。本日は第2セッション、4名の先生方、そして鈴木先生のコメントということで、活発な議論を行うことができました。最後、皆様から拍手を持って謝意を示していただければと思います。よろしくお願いします。